protests were the biggest news story for much of 2019. And it's likely they were one of the most recorded news events in history. Millions of cell phones were on the streets, capturing and relaying events in real time. Often the line between legitimate news reporters and protesters calling themselves citizen journalists was blurred and confusing. And there were occasions when ethical lines were crossed, as when this news photographer intentionally slammed a door shut to prevent a young mainland banker from escaping a hostile crowd. With their every move, gesture and reaction being scrutinized and magnified by the press, the police could be excused for feeling both cynical and helpless.
Most of the world will have seen how the Hong Kong protests were covered. It was simplified into a pro-Beijing versus pro-democracy showdown. That was the groupthink, that was the global narrative. I will go so far as to say they not only simplified, but they misrepresented, they embellished, they adopted it to their individual narratives, especially in the Western media. There was too much of the evil dictatorial regime clamping down on a hapless, helpless population, only asking for greater democracy. And a lot of it had to do with the descent of the movement into vandalism and hooliganism and extreme violence. Correspondents parachuted in here for a few months to talk about the glorious revolution. I would say there was a lot of unscrupulous reporting, scurrilous reporting, fake news.
There was never any fake news in Hong Kong until 2019. In such a visual situation, images are very open to manipulation.
Stills in hand-to-hand combat situation are very dangerous because they can show anything. Depending on angle, depending on the choice of photo, stills can show violence on one side or violence on the other side. Video clips, again, were very tightly edited. When you made the effort to look for the full clip, you got a different story completely.
Generally, the images told the story. There was a real narrative about what was going on in Hong Kong. Journalists like to see simple solutions to complex problems. So we did fall into good guy, bad guy narrative.
I totally sucked up the story that what was going on in Hong Kong was very simple. It was hero teens versus the evil empire. But slowly, I began to realize, Hong Kong is way more complex than that. I'm an old school journalist. I like to dig, I like to talk to people. And I found out that from 2013 onwards, there were other groups way down, buried, involved. They all were doing things in Hong Kong that were under the surface that no one was talking about. There was a big leak around October 2014. A BBC reporter talked about more than 1,000 Hong Kong people were trained.
The Oslo Freedom Forum isn't secret, but certainly obscure. In the basement of this 4-star hotel, human rights activists come to what feels a bit like a school for revolution.
The teaching here is to be successful, to topple a government for good. You have to be organised and to plan meticulously. And activists here have been involved in helping to organise the current protests in Hong Kong. Their plan to put thousands of people on the streets of the territory was in fact hatched nearly 2 years ago.
The revolution will be organised.
The protests became extremely violent very quickly, and they sustained that level of violence in a very orchestrated way. So that doesn't happen spontaneously. protest tactics which don't happen by online association. There's actual physical requirements for this type of tactics to be trained to people. The division of labour became very apparent to those who were trained to see this type of thing. There was significant orchestration, logistics, leadership. You could see key people, coordinating people, moving people, directing people. But where's it come from? I refer to it as the revolution industry. There's a huge array of NGOs which have been created in the past 25 to 30 years that have mushroomed. With each and every colour revolution that's happened across the world, it has literally become an industrial complex of revolution. You've got organisations like BAM, which is Build a Movement. They basically help structure a protest movement. Once they've completed their tasking, that's when the training aspect of it comes into play. A revolution consulting organisation, Canvas, come in at a training consulting level. They've got their basic training, probably delivered to a select handful of trainers who came back, impart their training domestically. The Albert Einstein Institution, they contribute to it indirectly. It's ideologically involved. It inspires the concepts of the movement, the leaders of the movement. One of its methodologies is to destroy the pillars of support for the government. So the Hong Kong police became a principal target for erosion, demonisation, delegitimization, dehumanization. Will ultimately help to bring down the government, because the government, if it's designed to stand on the pillars of support, if you erode 2 to 3 of them, then those other pillars become weak.
The Hong Kong police were one of the most loved police forces in the world, and yet the fact that that was all overturned is really extraordinary. Now, you can either say that it was a magical transmogrification. If you work for the Western press, that is the story you're pushing. But if you look a bit deeper, you realize that, okay, someone's doing some manipulation here. Someone's pushing the police brutality line to such an extent that it's actually not quite believable.
It was like shooting fish in a barrel, with violent confrontations nearly every day for months. Opportunities to show the police in a bad light were abundant. And that's exactly what happened. But let's be clear about this. It's important to acknowledge that in their use of retaliatory violence, some policemen probably did overreact. But these were extraordinary circumstances, under constant pressure from the protesters' guerrilla tactics, plus the incessant goading and doxing that was levelled at them. It's hardly surprising that fear and frustration played a part in the way the police handled themselves. In our next episode, we'll look at one of the most successful examples of how cleverly edited moving pictures were transformed into both the tools and the weapons of a successful insurrection.